Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we start this episode, I want to give you a trigger warning. We don't want to have your retrofuturism get mixed in with politics. Go watch the Steampunk's Beginner's Guide, for example, or one of my latest interviews with people like Jack Mack and the Steampunk March for Science, or watch any of the discussions on our channel. Go watch that. If you're still watching now, I assume you'll have no problems with this, and you want to know what's going out on there on the internet. I'll let you know. This is not the first time I've come across to something like this, but this is a special type.
Radio Retro Future.
I'm subscribed to several mailings, so I can stay posted on what's going on the area of retrofuturism. And all of a sudden, this appeared in my feed, titled, Mad Max isn't steampunk, and that's important. I have not seen that many articles on this, people saying that Mad Max is steampunk. I've seen some discussions, could it be Dieselpunk? So I was kind of surprised when I clicked this article, and all of a sudden, it read, Mad Max isn't steampunk, it's Dieselpunk. I thought it was a typical case of clickbait advertisement. Articles with really outrageous claims. Did you know this about milk? This will change your whole perception on the milking industry. So I thought this is a case of somebody who just wants to include a movie or other type of media they like into their favorite genre. And I wanted to debunk or clarify a number of the points raised in it. I didn't realize I was going down a rather dark rabbit hole though. Let's just start with the title that says that Mad Max is Dieselpunk, and I will address this more as we go on to it, but for the people who are not familiar with Mad Max Fury Road, it's basically one of the inventors of the post-apocalyptic genre as we know it today. So, the Mad Max movies are set in a post-apocalyptic world of Australia where the world will be devastated by a nuclear war. I say will be because in the first movie of Mad Max, the Third World War has not yet happened. When the second movie begins, society has completely degraded as all the major city centers have been nuked with all the consequences you could expect, turning Australia huge wastelands ruled by motor and bicycle gangs and people that are struggling for the resources that remain, especially things like gasoline and of course guns, which you need to survive. And both are very important themes in Mad Max Fury Road. The importance of Mad Max for the post-apocalyptic genre cannot be overstated. It has influenced many video games that we now know today, like the Fallout series, which is one of my favorite video game franchises, but also Rage, movies like Postman, Waterworld. So when the movie Mad Max Fury Road was announced after a long silence, people went out of their minds, especially because they promised practical effects like real motor stunts, real acrobats going from one vehicle to the next. It looked awesome, and the movie was exactly what we asked for. As far as I'm concerned, Mad Max Fury Road is what all Mad Max movies should have been. For that, one of my favorite Mad Max movies was Beyond Thunderdome, the third Mad Max movie, which is a bit of a controversial opinion to have, I know. But when you look at how the aesthetic became of the post-apocalyptic movement as we have it today in cosplay and video games, all that, it's mostly inspired by Beyond Thunderdome. And also they have the most memorable scenes in my opinion, even though they may be very corny. But Fury Road basically is this great spectacle, a very elaborate chase movie with over-the-top vehicles, gang leaders, desert pirates, waste raiders, all that good stuff. This is also a very good moment to just kind of fanboy out on how much I love Fury Road. And this is coming from somebody who isn't into movies all that much. So let's get into this article.
Much has been made of the visual aesthetic of Mad Max Fury Road, from its orange and blue saturated landscapes to its dramatic special effects. But one theme has reoccurred in discussions of the film, and it's a wrong one. Mad Max isn't steampunk. It's easy to see why casual viewers might think that it is. It's got brass and cogs and goggles, all well-known parts of a steampunk visual aesthetic.
This is one of those parts that I talked about a lot. Basically this idea that somehow steampunk has a monopoly on brass, cogs and goggles. And I have argued that this is simply not the case. We see it in fantasy, and of course we see it in post-apocalyptic movies as well. And here is something really weird going on in this article right away, because it doesn't mention post-apocalyptic genres at all. It completely ignores it, which really thought was weird, because as far as the author is concerned from the outset of the article, if it isn't steampunk, it must be dieselpunk. No other genres beyond these two seem to exist in her mind. And this is the rabbit hole I was talking about.
You might not think this distinction matters. After all, the movement is easily confused. Both involve cool cosplay and a fascination with alternate historical views of the world. But Dieselpunk differs from steampunk in several crucial ways that informs the politics of Fury Road.
Okay, so first he is talking about the aesthetics of Dieselpunk, and now all of a sudden he is talking about the politics of Fury Road. Now there is a lot to be said about what the antagonist of this film, Immortan Joe, may represent. There is no real talk on politics. We know very little other than the bare basics of the society, of how these gangs in the movie are organized, to say there's any real case of politics. As a matter of fact, when you look at most reviews on the internet, people talk about Immortan Joe as a cult leader. And this is something very important in the context of this article to talk about. Yeah, you probably still don't know where this is going, but trust me, there's gonna be a rather interesting and unexpected money shot here.
The core of steampunk concept is the world of the future still runs on steam power. Steam-powered ships, airships, vehicles, trains. It's a sustainable resource, and it gives the steampunk universe the freedom to experiment with alternate histories, or magical one if you're into that. Dieselpunk, on the other hand, fixates on the early 20th century, particularly the 1920s and 1940s. Dieselpunk society is powered entirely by diesel. In the Dieselpunk world, technology may yield power, but it comes at a cost. In Dieselpunk, the energy of pre-war Art Deco and the emerging technologies comes at a head-to-head with wary cynicism in a world made bleak by World War II. Dieselpunk emphasizes war and weaponry, where steampunk emphasizes peace and technological invention. Dieselpunk is gritty and grimy, where steampunk is clean. Dieselpunk emphasizes auxiliary steel and iron. In essence, steampunk is gold and brass, Dieselpunk is silver and chrome. Dieselpunk is a society of depletion, which brings us, of course, to Mad Max Fury Road. Normally, Dieselpunk society evolves from the anachronistic point in history, but the world of Mad Max has eroded there instead. The only cars that can survive in a post-apocalyptic wasteland are older cars made of steel and muscle. Those metals aren't signifiers of evolution or technology, but decay and enslavement. The core resources that are fueling their culture are also killing them.
So here is this really weird dichotomy between Dieselpunk and steampunk that I don't think is necessarily true. What's just plain wrong about this is that steampunk isn't future prediction. It isn't science fiction as we understand science fiction to be. It is alternate history. And this is probably the only thing that Dieselpunks and steampunks agree on. It's alternate history. Already you've got this author saying that's something clearly wrong. Now, I will not fault her. I don't think this is a person that understands a lot about steampunk to begin with, especially when you say something like this. And I see this idea that steampunk is future prediction, only that the Victorian culture somehow continued into the future. It seems to be something you see a lot on websites like BuzzFeed's Daily Dot, where this was published on, etc., etc. And let me tell you, it's just plain wrong. Steampunks want to recreate history. They kind of like to envision histories as they would like them to have happened, or they want to play how science fiction, or I should say futuristic technology, would influence a past society. So when you have the difference engine, which basically kicked off the steampunk genre, they introduced computers into the Victorian era and basically explored what that would do with a Victorian era, with all the conflicts that were going on, like the Mexican-American War, for example. Also the aesthetic, when you look at it, Dieselpunks and steampunks pretty much like the same thing. They really like the same kind of aesthetics. They just put an emphasis on a different kind of era. Like the steampunks most usually use the 18th century, 19th century aesthetics, and the dieselpunks usually use those 1920s interbellum era aesthetics. But they do take a lot of the same influence. They use the same pop culture references. For example, they both are very much inspired by pop culture. So you have Dieselpunk's version of Darth Vader and steampunk versions of Darth Vader. So when it comes down to it, they basically do the same thing. There is not a clear distinction between the two. Dieselpunk also isn't that well known, especially in Europe. It's still something that people use when they talk about video games or something. Yeah, that game is kind of dieselpunkish and that game is more steampunkish. But beyond that, dieselpunk isn't really well known here. And even in the United States, what we see most is the steampunk community. And I know there are some dieselpunk gatherings, but there just aren't that many. Also, this later argument that the dieselpunk society is powered entirely by diesel and the dieselpunk world technology may yield power but it comes at a cost. This is a very common theme in both steampunk and dieselpunk. As a matter of fact, the difference engine, which I mentioned before, was supposed to be cyberpunk in the past. It was about how technology would improve a past society, but also the very dark aspects of that technological advancement, especially in a time where eugenics and, well, rather totalitarian ideas were a very common opinion to have.
In Dieselpunk, the energy of pre-war Art Deco and its emergent technology comes head-to-head with the weary cynicism of a world made bleak by World War II. Dieselpunk emphasizes war and weaponry, where steampunk emphasizes peace and technological invention. Dieselpunk is gritty and grimy, where steampunk is clean. Dieselpunk emphasizes artillery, steel, and iron. In essence, steampunk is gold and brass, dieselpunk is silver and chrome.
She mixes up steampunk and dieselpunk as these two pillars that cannot be changed, and even then her description isn't really accurate. Usually people compare dieselpunk with the very clean Art Deco lines, very streamlined, very minimalistic, and it is steampunk they associate with the very busy, over-detailed types of design. Also, the fact that there is more emphasis on war in dieselpunk, I cannot agree with that. There are a lot of war-inspired stories, genres, movies, short films. Guns are literally everywhere in the steampunk subcommunity. So this is simply not true. And I'm still wondering, why does it have to be dieselpunk? It's still really weird. And also, post-apocalyptic. Never mentioned at all. What she seems to emphasize is that dieselpunk is post-apocalyptic, because basically that steampunk is the future prediction of a kind of utopian society that's based on the Victorian aesthetic, and dieselpunk is this post-apocalyptic society. No. Just no. You're wrong. Yeah, there are, in all fairness, some steampunk-inspired tales about such futures, but technically speaking, they are not steampunk. They are simply science fiction with a steampunk aesthetic. There's a difference there.
What once was a society of Art Deco decadence has become a wasteland where everything glitters but nothing is gold. Their vision of a heaven as a glittery, shinier metropolis is less Valhalla and more 1920s Manhattan. And so deep is the Warboys' dedication to a Morton Jones dieselpunk aesthetic that before they die they spray their mouths with chrome.
No. Morton Jones' aesthetic is really particular because he has this glass-like armor on which you can see all the boils he has, which might be radiation sickness. It's not explained. The story does not tell how he got sick, other than he always needed that rebreather, and the boils may have been something that developed later on in his life. It's really weird. They say that the Warboys' dedication to a Morton Joe dieselpunk aesthetic is mentioned here, and that they spray their mouths with chrome because of dieselpunk.
Fury Road has a clear environmental message. The world's emphasis on diesel fuel has run it into the ground. Some views of the movie have criticized the Axis as implausible, but Axis fueled by nihilism is a core part of the Dieselpunk aesthetic. Moreover, it's precisely the entire point of the film. Immortan Joe's patriarchy is so committed to excess and waste, it can't stop even when it's literally poisoning and sickening itself.
Once again, I salute my Imperator Furiosa, and I salute my Half-Life warboys, who will ride with me eternal on the highways of Valhalla. I am your Redeemer. It is by my hand you will rise from the ashes of this world.
Immortan Joe is a cult leader. He has this enormous messiah complex, and he sees himself as a savior. In the comics, it's known that people tend to think that Immortan Joe is literally immortal, that he literally is a savior. Like I showed in the clip, people want to have a personal relationship with Immortan Joe, because if they do, they can ride with him internally on the highways toward Valhalla. That's why they spray their mouths with chrome. That's the reason why they do this and shiny and chrome. All that are religious statements. Now, why did I go through all the way of describing that? Remember that rabbit hole I was talking about? Yeah, there's also this emphasis on diesel fuel. In Mad Max they don't use diesel, they use gasoline. So yeah, there you can say there's an environmental message in that movie, because that's one of the things why water is so important, so plants can grow. And Furiosa's reason, as I recall correctly, was to go somewhere and plant seeds. However, that area turned out to be completely barren. So they need to go back to the Citadel and plant the seeds there, where they do have water. I guess you can call it an environmental message. Now, also this Dieselpunk is cyberpunk in the past. The Second World War is a major source of inspiration. That he's dedicated to excess. I do believe he thinks what he's doing is right, that he wants to create a new race that is unafflicted by many of the diseases this society has. That's why he has this harem of women that in the movie escape, and that he wants to get back because they can provide his healthy children, and he considers himself to be very important in that process, which once again goes back to his messiah complex. Excess, the only scene I can really think of is where he gives water to these wretches. And this whole scene where the water comes down on the wretches who are holding up all these bowls to catch the water more reminds me of the spectacle in the Roman arenas, where they would have these extremely elaborate bread and game type things to both entertain and feed the populace. I'm giving you this water. Me, I am doing that. I am Immortan Joe, your savior. So where this article is going doesn't sit well with me. If anything, the movie seems to be a microcosm of what's going on in the world today, where we depend on certain factions for oil, even if those factions are really disagreeable with our own values. And this is where the water, guns and fuel trichotomy comes in. And of course, weapons and fuel are important, but none of those two are as important as the water that Joe personally controls. Gastown and the Bullet Farm, which are two satellite states or vassals of Immortan Joe. And yeah, we have relationships with other nations like that in this world, like Saudi Arabia, which has not a very good track record when it comes to human rights. And we have plenty of such nations who we depend on, but would otherwise not consider allies. And the same goes for the wretched population who depend on Immortan Joe for water, whether they believe him to be an actual deity or not. They worship him because, well, if they don't, they'll die of thirst. And what happens when they bring Immortan Joe dead body back to the Citadel? Yeah, the rats grab it and rip it apart. Literally. They realize that they have been deceived, or they never liked Immortan Joe to begin with and saw him for the cult leader that he actually was. Now, the case in point though, the story of Mad Max Fury Road, it's one of my favorite movies ever, is not that special. It doesn't really explore deep philosophical concepts, but it does know how to visually tell a story. Unfortunately, there are some details missing, especially when I read the comics. I expected to learn more on the history of Immortan Joe and how he came to power and how he got his disease, because I thought that could play into his character. But no, it turns out was always just a warlord. He conquered the Citadel and its water supply and used that to rule all the surrounding areas and created this cult of personality, claiming to be this divine savior of the human race, which reminds me a hell of a lot more of the story of Muhammad than it does what the writer of this article claims it represents. Going down that rabbit hole again.
Dieselpunk relies on depictions of a futuristic world still clinging to a nebulous 1940s mystique. Along with elevating the war era 20th century, Dieselpunk has often been criticized for fetishizing and embracing fascism and fascist ideals. A fascination with Nazi regimentation is a recurring theme with certain subcommunities of Dieselpunk, and the genre has given rise to a subgenre, Dieselpunk, that functions partially as a critique on its whiteness.
Got any citations for that article? Any references we can check out? Any quotes from known Dieselpunks that say that, hey, Hitler did nothing wrong? And images of Dieselpunks marching around demanding more Lebensraum? Anything? No? Not a single one? Yeah, I'm just gonna have to take your word for it, I suppose, huh? That's good, Bleach. Okay, this is where the entire article was going. This is why it kept drilling on the term Dieselpunk on the whole bloody article. So she could connect Dieselpunk to fascism. There is a very thin line, indeed, between religion, especially organized religion, and fascism, because the two go very much hand in hand. But there are some very important differences that makes it all the more important why these two gel so well together. Fascism has a lot of those same aspects. Of course, the leadership, the party is always right, and especially the leader of said party is always right. We see this, of course, with Hitler and Mussolini. However, what's important here, in Mad Max, people want a personal relationship with Immortan Joe. Now you can say that Nazis want a relationship with Hitler, but when you look at Hitler's speeches and the speech that Immortan Joe gives, they are completely different. Because Immortan Joe's speech is that I will give you salvation if you follow me. In case of people like Hitler and Mussolini, he always talks about the we. We are the chosen people. We deserve more than what we got. We deserve more Lebensraum. We deserve to be the chosen people that is chosen by a deity. Especially a lot of explanations why the other groups are nothing but bastards. It's the reason why Hitler demonized the Jews. It's why they demonized the Slavs, and especially the communists. In this case, we don't see anything of that going on. Immortan Joe seems to be completely fixated on his own messiah complex. We see people who want to sacrifice them for Immortan Joe, not for this cause he proclaims to have. He is the savior. In case of fascists, the people are their own saviors. However, that people do need strong leadership to tell them where to go. Fascists therefore are often very totalitarian. They're often for the segregation of ideologies and genetic populations, or races if you want to call them like that, because fascists assume that people are very violent beings that need to be controlled, and that the state is the only way to do that. Of course, when you are an individual in such a society, you do have your own egotistical tendencies. You know, we are individuals. We all have different desires and dreams. And this is why religion gels so well with this, because religion says that if you support this ideology, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. That's why so many fascist organizations have religious affiliations, and we see this with Christian organizations, and we see this especially in the Middle East, where fascism is a really popular ideology right now. Fascism really works on identity politics, the idea of us versus them. Those people in the past have wronged us, therefore it's justified that we conquer them in the present. So this whole idea of this being fascistic is only here for one reason. And it's to shame Dieselpunks. That seems to be the primal motivation. This has a lot to do with the current climate on the internet and media, where you have these cliques of bloggers and journalists basically patting themselves on the back. Look what a good person I am. I'm fighting fascism online. However, they have to look for fascists everywhere. So this one goes after the Dieselpunks because they happen to like Hugo Boss. But not only that, it is even getting worse, because here they say that Dieselpunk, which is basically Afro-American centric version of Steampunk and Dieselpunk, is a reaction to fascist elements within Dieselpunk. Listen, the Dieselpunk community ain't that large to begin with. Yeah, there are plenty, but when you compare it to Steampunk, it's very little. And don't think that Steampunk is not being argued to be very similar to this. There are plenty of articles out there that say that Steampunks are pro-imperial white supremacists. Yeah, also they don't explain what they mean with this. Like, they don't explain what he means with fascist. And to say that Dieselpunks are a reaction to this is just pure nonsense. Here's a TED Talk by Tim Fielder, who I had on the show. Go check that out if you want to know more about Dieselpunk. And basically here he's talking about how Dieselpunk started for him.
And we grew up around DC Comics, reading Marvel comics. Would eventually go on to read Heavy Metal magazine. But you know, when you read these things, the people in those comics really don't look like you. You know, they look like, you know, the big white guy with the muscles, and, you know, he flew away. That's what happened. And again, myself and people like me, we didn't see ourselves in that material. You know, we wanted to be the one that would fly off the roof with the expanding cape, right? We wanted to be the ones who would be able to show, you know, we're the Dark Knight. We wanted to have that opportunity too.
So yeah, Dieselpunk is basically a reaction that there was too little emphasis on black scientists and celebrities, and the black influence on pop culture. That's how Dieselpunk got started, and it was successful because we see a lot more diversity, as they like to call it, within the Steampunk and Dieselpunk community when it comes to these kinds of topics. So they were successful, and the necessity for Dieselpunk, is it really necessary at this point? Well, that's a whole another discussion which I will not get into. But there is no such animosity as described here between the Dieselpunks and Dieselpunks.
It's rare to see depictions of Dieselpunk on film, much less as part of a fully realized universe. But in Mad Max, George Miller doesn't just recreate the aesthetic, he eviscerates it. He demonizes fascist tactics of aggression and conquest. He draws upon the very cultural element that Dieselpunk is founded on. Over-industrialization and militarization, imperialism. But instead of depicting them as beautiful, he depicts them as utterly unsustainable, both as a technology and a culture.
Here we see the author just doubling down on this idea that Mad Max must be steampunk because he wants this to be a deconstruction of fascism. I don't think anyone left this movie thinking, damn, that was some good critiques on Dieselpunk. And she also called it a critique on fascist violence. And here she simply reveals her own bias. Like, what is fascist violence exactly? And this is written in 2015. We didn't have the violent attacks by the Antifa yet in the United States. In Europe, the Antifa exists a lot longer, and they've been associated with all kinds of arsonies and assassinations. Although that's a more violent offshoot called the Rote Armee Fraktion, but they're basically the same kinds of people. This is all this is. He really wants this to be some critique on fascism without really defining what he means with fascism. So it all comes back to the whole same thing what I mentioned before. He wants to shame Dieselpunks. That's it. That's basically the entire nature of this article. And the weird thing is, like I said, I've seen more articles like this, and they just blatantly say, yeah, steampunks are fascist sympathizers. And the only reason why I can think of why she did this is one particular reason. In March 2017, while the original article was written in 2015, so they've been trying to get this article up in the ratings again, get clicks, and clicks equal money. This is what this is all about. It's just clickbait. So should we take the offer seriously? Yes and no. This is the problem with the current media landscape. This article is not the cause, it's a symptom of something that's really, really wrong in media in general. This idea that when you are writing partisan articles, you make more money. And yes, this is true. You have a far higher retention rate if you cater to a specific type of ideology. This is that Fox News does. This is what NBC does. They only show one side of the story that supports a narrative that they have created. And this article is no different. In this case, he supports this narrative that goes around in these really progressive circles that fascists are everywhere, they infiltrated all subcultures. We need to purge the fascists, we need to call out the fascists, and we need to, I don't know, because they never really ask for solutions. Like in this article, it's just, yeah, Dieselpunks are fascists. Well, what do Dieselpunks have to do to change that? He doesn't ask, and he will not tell you. There is no way to please these people, so don't even bother unless you want to be the target of a witch hunt, because that's how these things generally tend to go. And we've seen this over and over and over again. But to come back to this whole media narrative being spun here, media companies think people want to read articles that appeal to their particular kind of bias. And in this case, it's not written for Dieselpunks, it's not written to be a critique of Mad Max. No, it's to please the people that criticize Dieselpunk to begin with, that they are fascist, neo-Nazi sympathizers. So, to end this rather weird trip into the minds of ideologues, so after this rather bizarre trip down the rabbit hole into the mind of an ideologue, or someone who claims to be one of these hipsters that like to think everyone is fascist, who does not agree with their particular brand of politics, yeah, ignore it. That's probably the best thing you can do. And yeah, I know that kind of sounds hypocritical right now, but I really want you to understand where this kind of blogging comes from. This is not journalism. This is somebody who's blogging her opinion, and the author of this article has written various such things. If somebody criticizes you for being a fascist, if somebody calls you a neo-Nazi because you happen to like a specific brand of clothing, or like to make things, or like to tell certain stories, there is only one solution and prevents any more public shaming, and that is keep making things your way. I am Bonsford of Radio Retro Future. I hope I will not have to make a habit out of treating such political laden subjects and articles, but when I see something like this, I just feel inclined to call it out. And it's more importantly, why do we call it out? What do we call them out on, and what do we use for arguments? Because this is not just about Dieselpunk, this is about artistic expression as a whole. Yeah, now I will not expect any anti-fascists to appear at Dieselpunk or Steampunk conventions, fortunately not. However, this is not the first time I've seen something like this, and this is not the last time I will either. And in the future, I might have a discussion on this subject with Eric Fisk of the Fedora Chronicles. They have a podcast called The Metaphysical Connection, where they discuss things like conspiracy theories on aliens and other supernatural events. So yeah, we had them on the show more often. So if you're interested in those kind of things, go check out those podcasts as well. Like I said, keep making things your way. It's important.